Hey there, I'm Ari Altman from the Tech Buyers Guru, and I'm back to show you how to set up your high-end PC in 2019. What I have behind me is a system that I've built over 3 episodes here on YouTube. I first demonstrated how we stripped down the case, installed the power supply and the fans. In the next episode, we installed the CPU, the RAM, and the solid-state drive. And in the final episode, we installed the liquid CPU cooler and the video card. Well, in this episode, what I'm going to be showing you is how to set up Windows 10 on a brand new solid-state drive. And I'm also going to show you which software suites you should install from your motherboard vendor, as well as perhaps some other third-party suites that I'm going to show you once we get this system up and running. So, without further ado, let's press the power button and see what happens. I should say that I have my Windows 10 USB stick installed or inserted in the back of this system. So we're going to press the power button, see what happens. As is typical, it actually runs through a couple of boot sequences there just to test the RAM, but it looks like it's going to be turning on here. So we should get a display on the screen. You can see some RGB lighting. I'm going to be talking at the end of this episode about the various applications you can use to control your RGB lighting. See if we get anything on screen. I'm not panicked, and for good reason, because yes, indeed, it is coming up. Now, I do not have an operating system installed on this PC. So, ideally, the system will detect the Windows 10 thumb drive that's inserted into the PC. Looks like it's doing that right now. So, you get to choose your language, your time and currency format, and then also your keyboard or input method. So I'm in the US, so I'm going to go ahead and stick with the defaults. Got to turn my mouse on there. Here we go. And I just go install now. Pretty simple, right? Well, I will have to select my solid state drive, so that should be coming up in a second. Right now it's probably just unpacking. This is where you activate Windows. I'm going to do that later. I'm going to say I don't have a product key. You can always activate it later. Alright, so here, select the operating system you want. There's quite a few options, but remember, you have to choose the one that you have a license for. So I have a license for Windows 10 Home. I'm going to choose that one. These are the license terms, you know, the fine print. I'm just going to accept them. You can choose to read all this stuff if you'd like. And then we can do an upgrade where you install Windows and keep your files, or what they call custom, which is install Windows only. Well, on a brand new PC, you're not upgrading anything. You're not keeping files, settings, or applications. So you go to custom. Now that's a little counterintuitive that just installing Windows on a brand new PC is called custom, but I'm choosing custom here. Now this is where I get to choose which of my drives I want to install on. Now you want to be careful here, because with 2 drives installed in a system, I want to make sure I do not accidentally install Windows 10 on my secondary drive, which is my Crucial MX500. So let's go with the unallocated space. Okay, so Windows is installing. If you do have 2 drives that are of the exact same size and both are unnamed in the Windows 10 installer, you may have to do a little trial and error. I think some people probably end up accidentally installing just their secondary drive, and that may be a 1 terabyte hard drive. You certainly don't want Windows on that. So you'll just have to do your best. If you have 2 identically sized solid state drives, or I should say any storage drives in your system. Now, another thing that I'm interested in here is how long it takes to install Windows 10 on a brand new solid state drive from the USB 3.0 flash drive. You can see first it copies the Windows files, then it gets the files ready. It's going fairly quickly. This should probably take about 5 minutes. So while we are waiting for this to end, I'm just going to give you a couple other tips. In addition to Windows 10, you actually need drivers installed on your system. Now, Microsoft has gotten really good about bundling a lot of default drivers in with the Windows 10 operating system. That doesn't mean that everything you need is going to be installed right from the start. One of the things that you absolutely need to get is your motherboard drivers, and that's going to be on the website of your motherboard vendor. In this case, behind all these components, we have an Asus motherboard. Another thing that's really important to know is that if you have built-in wireless in your system, it's very unlikely that Windows is going to have the drivers for your Wi-Fi card. And so probably a lot of people get stuck on this point where, because you boot up your system and the first thing you want to do is get on the internet and download everything. But if you don't have a wired connection, you may have a problem. So just keep that in mind when you're getting your brand new high-end PC set up. You may have to connect it to a wired Ethernet connection, or you may have to download your Wi-Fi drivers from another PC. So now Windows is installing updates. It's a little hard to know what that is if it isn't actually connected to the internet, which I don't believe it is. So that happened pretty quickly because it couldn't actually connect to the internet. I'll have to look back at this video afterwards to tell you exactly how long this took, but it seemed like it took about 5 minutes. Once I go back and review the video, I'll be sure how long it took, but it didn't take too long. So now the system's going to restart. Okay, we've got our splash screen from the Asus motherboard, so that's a good sign. We saw that before though, so we want to get to the next step. Is Windows going to boot? Now I still have my flash drive in there. I want to make sure it's not booting from the flash drive. We'll see in a moment. Actually, I believe, okay, you might as well leave that flash drive in there. I actually don't know when Windows installation is complete, in the sense that it doesn't have to pull stuff from the flash drive anymore. So you can see it says getting ready here. I don't think it's pulling from the flash drive, but just keep it in until you're done. It's actually smart enough to know, obviously, not to continue booting from the installation drive. So as Windows is getting ready, I'll just mention a couple of other items you'll want to download, which I'll be doing later, but I won't be stepping through the website showing you each thing that I'm downloading. You want your video card drivers, so we have a GeForce card in here that's an NVIDIA card. You get those drivers actually from NVIDIA. It's possible that each video card manufacturer also has a website where you can download the drivers, but it's faster to go straight to NVIDIA. So I won't go, for instance, to EVGA. This is an EVGA branded NVIDIA GeForce card. I'm not going to go to EVGA to get those drivers, although I could, because I know NVIDIA will always have the most recent drivers. A fourth thing, in addition to motherboard, Wi-Fi, and video card, is your sound card drivers, your audio drivers. That may come pre-bundled with Windows 10. It depends on your the sound card you have, either built into your motherboard or an additional add-in card. But usually you do want to actually download those drivers to get the most out of your audio. Okay, now let's start with the region. It says United States. Yes, I'm in the United States, so I'm just showing you the steps you have to go through. Is this right, the keyboard? Yeah, US. Okay. I'm going to skip adding a second keyboard. Connect to an internet. Okay. So now it is finding, this is interesting. I'm using built-in Wi-Fi on my Asus motherboard. Actually, here's the antenna right here that came with the Asus motherboard. So I was under the presumption that I might not be able to get Wi-Fi. Remember, I have not run any Asus utilities on this 970 Pro disk. This is a fresh install of Windows 10. It did find a Wi-Fi driver though, and that's a great thing. So I was warning you about this before, but Windows 10 apparently was able to read this Asus, this built-in Wi-Fi controller, and is able to go forward. That may be because this is a Z390 chipset, and Wi-Fi is actually built into the Z390 chipset. Not every motherboard actually implements that, so you don't necessarily have like the antennas that are required. But this is something Intel built in, and so if there's something that's really common, that's built into a chipset, Windows, or Microsoft I should say, usually will integrate the driver into Windows because it's so common. That may be why we got here. So I'm just letting you know, you may not get this lucky, but I'm going to connect to one of my Wi-Fi networks here. Let's see. Oh, I see. I have to turn on numlock. Okay, so let's, I think that's right. Okay, so I'm connected to a network. So that's great, because what's going to happen now is it will automatically download updates. We may have some big updates, at which point I might have to actually stop rolling the camera here, because it could take a long time if there's a major update that wasn't on this installation disk. That's another tip I have to share with you, and I'm sorry I have to share this with you, but because Microsoft is now updating Windows 10 every spring and fall, when you buy a copy of Windows 10 on a flash drive or a DVD, it's very likely to be out of date. And that means even though you've just gone through this process, spent 5 or 10 minutes installing Windows 10 to your system, the very first thing you're going to need to do is actually update it with a really big download. So just be aware of that. So another thing you're going to want to install, in addition to the the motherboard chipset software, your video card software, your Wi-Fi software if it doesn't automatically download, and your audio software is your RGB software. So one of the things that I've been pushing hard here on the channel and on my site, as well as with manufacturers, is universal RGB controls. And so I'm very pleased that just about all the components in this box back here can be controlled via the Asus Ora software. So we're going to go ahead and show you where that is. Okay, of course I don't have Google Chrome on here, right, because it's a fresh install, so I guess I'll just go ahead and use Microsoft Edge to go to the Asus website so I can show you what I want to download. I am just going to do a search for Maximus, let's see, what's the name? Maximus 11 Hero. There we go. So I'm just going to quickly show you what I would choose to download. There's going to be a ton of things that are listed here. A lot of them are unnecessary. So I would go to Support, and then Drivers. Choose your OS, and of course this is Windows 10 64-bit. No one uses 32-bit anymore. We have our VGA drivers. That's for built-in Intel graphics. If you're building a high-end PC in 2019, you're not using that. So I'm not even going to bother with that. Windows 10 probably loaded a default driver, and I don't really care. I have this monitor hooked up to the video card. I don't need that. Always good to look at the latest BIOS. There was one released March 22nd, 2019. That happens to be 3 days ago. I know that I don't have that loaded on this motherboard because I have not flashed this motherboard since I took it out of the box. So that's something that I would probably want to download, something to keep in mind. Let's see what else. We've got our audio drivers, so that is something I would download, and they have a beta version here from February 2019. Here are my LAN drivers for the Intel Gigabit Ethernet. Very likely that was installed by Windows 10. That's another thing. If you use wired Ethernet, you'll probably want to get the latest LAN drivers, although not much has changed in terms of gigabit LAN in probably a decade. But the drivers were released, let's see, 12 days ago, so something must be new. Then we get into the utilities. There's a lot of utilities. Most of them won't be of use to most people. I like the suites that are included with every motherboard vendor's motherboard. This is called, Asus has its AI suite, Gigabyte has its System Information Viewer, and then they have another name for their overarching suite. ASRock has a suite, MSI has a suite. So you'll want to look for that suite because that'll allow you to, say, overclock from within Windows, control your fan speeds, which I really like to do, get temperature data, that kind of thing. So it's probably a good idea to at least check it out. You may decide you don't want that running on your PC, but every vendor has some kind of software suite. I should mention something that's kind of funny that I've gleaned from a lot of hardware manufacturers over the years, and that is that software is actually pretty hard to do. And even if you're a motherboard manufacturer that does a great job, creating hardware, that doesn't necessarily mean that you know how to do software. You have a team of really excellent software programmers. So one thing that I'm always a little bit surprised at is how buggy motherboard software is. even though the hardware is, top notch. Motherboard manufacturers rarely release a motherboard that is missing a lot of functionality, or the hardware isn't wired correctly on the board, but they often release software that isn't really up to snuff. And that's just because hardware manufacturers do hardware, and software is kind of secondary to them. At the same time, you wouldn't expect a company like, well, we could take Microsoft, for example, or Google, for example. Those are primarily software companies, and they do make some hardware, but they haven't always got hardware right. Particularly Google, by the way. But that's just an example that, these companies specialize in certain industries, and hardware and software are completely different. Even if they're both in the PC industry, they're completely different. So don't be surprised if you download some software and find it's kind of buggy, and then you may wish to uninstall it. There's a whole lot of other stuff on here. The Asus Ora software is Asus's RGB software, and that I want to install. So I'm going to click download here. If you have Gigabyte, they call that RGB Fusion. If you have ASRock, I think they call it like Polychrome or RGB. They may have simplified the name. If you have MSI, I think that's Mystic Light. All right. So if you're using a modern PC and you have any RGB components in there, you may want to download your motherboard vendor's RGB software, because that's probably going to be the best way to integrate the lighting on your system. So I'm just going to run that in the background here. Oh, I guess it's downloaded already. Now I'm not going to go through the setup of, your Wi-Fi software or your audio software, but I am going to show you what can be done with RGB software, because I think that's pretty important for people building a modern PC to understand. For many years, people didn't do lighting at all on PCs. Then about 10 years ago, you got some LEDs. So you might have a fan in the front of your PC, like a red LED, and people said, oh, that's great. Or other people said, that looks silly. I don't want lighting in my PC. And then we got into RGB lighting a few years ago, but that was often controlled with a hardware switch on the case. So you might be able to flip through, say, 7 different colors. Today, what we have is something a lot more sophisticated. We have standards for RGB controls, and they've even gone further. We now have standards for ARGB, which is addressable RGB. That's digital RGBs. So where you have, say, one component that has 12 different lights in it, you can set each of those 12 lights to a different color. Or more likely, what you can see is they'll do a rainbow spiral. You don't actually say, this system probably has, I don't know, 100 LED bulbs in it. I don't go in and program each of those 100 bulbs, but what I can do is allow it to do kind of a rainbow cycle. So it's detecting that I have an what they call an add strip or an add-on strip, right? I can shut that off or I can leave it on. That strip is actually not just a lighting strip, but it's actually also my cooler and my case fans, because I'm using a Thermaltake ARGB cooler and case fans. They are all hooked up as if they were one single addressable RGB strip. What you do not see on here is RAM, and this is something that I do need to point out about this system. As you can see, this does have RGB RAM. This is quite possibly the finest RGB RAM on the market. It's Corsair's Dominator RGB Platinum. The problem is that this RAM is so sophisticated, so advanced, that Corsair has not enabled the use of third-party software to control it. So if I want to control the RGB lights on my Dominator RAM, I cannot use Asus Ora software or any other motherboard software, even though I could do that with older versions of Corsair RAM. Corsair was the first RAM manufacturer to integrate motherboard controls into its RAM with its Vengeance RGB RAM. That was a fantastic product. With Dominator, perhaps there's something different about the hardware. This is an addressable RAM set, so that makes it a little bit more sophisticated. Whatever the case is, I have to download Corsair's iCUE software to control this RAM. So that's a little bit sad to me, because everything else is being controlled by Asus Ora. I've got front fans, I've got the pump header, I've got my cooler fans, and all I have to do in Asus Aura is say I want, I'm going to say, they've got something called Starry Night. I actually have no idea what that is, but I'm just going to go ahead and apply it. So what does Starry Night do? Well, it turned all my fans and my light strip red. That's not that interesting. Let's try color cycle. So what you can see here is all of fans in my system as well as my pump header, and although it's subtle, my motherboard too, that my motherboard has lighting. You can see that there. That's actually in sync with the fans. There it is, green to blue. Okay, that's all in sync. There are two components in the system that aren't in sync, and that's the EVGA video card, which requires its own EVGA software, and my Corsair RAM, which requires the iCUE software from Corsair. The only way to get everything fully integrated is to match your video card manufacturer with your motherboard manufacturer. So I would have to go with an Asus video card here. And then, of course, going with Corsair Vengeance RGB RAM. That would work. If I'm using Dominator like I have here, I gotta use Corsair software. I'm going to just show you a couple other examples of RGB controls. We have rainbow color cycle. Let's see what that does. It's really subtle here, but if you can see that back fan, you may notice that not all the lights are the same color at the same time. It's really subtle here. But I'm seeing, for instance, that, okay, right there I saw some of the lights turned purple before others, and now some are turning pink. So that's what addressable means, that they kind of go in series, right? So it's not the whole fan turning blue or purple at the same time. Each light in sequence turns that color, which is pretty neat. And the fans up here are doing the exact same thing. Oh, that's interesting. So what we see up here is that these fans are actually kind of in their own series. So purple to purple. So that's pretty cool. This is called rainbow cycle. So these are not random colors. It's actually cycling through those as if they were part of one giant light strip. So that is really, really pretty cool. All right? All of those fans are actually connected to the very same motherboard header. And yet, addressable RGB or digital RGB means they can each get their own command. So, if each of those fans has 12 LEDs in it, I now have something like, and then you also have I have two more fans in the front, that one in the rear. That's, let's say that's 12 times 6, 72 individual RGBs are all going in series. That is a pretty cool feature. The only problem here is I don't know that they're going in order from, say, back to front or front to back. If you were really, if you wanted to be really organized about it, you would plug in each fan in order. I did not do that. But that is pretty cool. If you think about the options there, you could kind of have a waterfall effect, you know, going from blue to green, and then it shifts back to the back of your case and then all over again. So this is the power of integrated RGB software, and here we have addressable RGB software. This is really pretty cool stuff. And so I am a little disappointed that Corsair has pulled that capability from its Dominator Platinum RGB RAM. I'm a little disappointed EVGA has not jumped on board with the standards. EVGA's video cards don't work with any motherboard as far as I know. And then, of course, like I said, if you wanted RGB controls for your Asus video card, you'd have to use an Asus motherboard. Same with Gigabyte. You go with the Gigabyte motherboard, MSI motherboard. That's certainly feasible, but it's a little bit of a drawback when you know, if you want to be able to mix and match. But overall, I'm pretty pleased with this lighting setup that I'm able to do with Asus Ora Software and the Thermaltake's ARGB fans. I think that looks pretty good. And this is just with a couple of minutes of tweaking. So there's a lot more options. While we're doing this, I might as well show you what that RAM looks like. Alright, I'm back with the iCUE software. It actually indicated that I needed a firmware update for my RAM, and I just want to show you something pretty cool that Corsair has implemented. It actually has a timer or a countdown timer built into the RAM sticks. As the firmware applies, it's actually showing each stick updated. So I'm now on my 4th stick. Okay, so that's pretty cool, Corsair, I must admit. As my firmware is updating, I can see the progress on my RAM. That is pretty neat. I can also see it on my screen, by the way. I'm at 100% now. So here is my Corsair RAM in its full glory. And you can see it has a lot of lighting effects. I'm going to try to show you kind of the most interesting. So certainly it can go kind of do a wave. It's doing a color wave. But you can also set it up so that, I think they call it a spiral rainbow. Watch this, guys. I'm going to apply this. This is kind of insane. Because this is the first RAM kit that has addressable RGBs, what you're seeing is different colors of RGB on the same RAM stick. Okay? So there you can see kind of we're going from purple to, or green to blue, and it's like a waterfall down the stick as opposed to across from one stick to the next. That is something you cannot do with motherboard software, and I'm guessing that is why Corsair is not implementing any, or allowing, I should say, any motherboard controls of this Dominator RAM. It's just a little bit too sophisticated. Its lighting controller is a little bit too advanced. You couldn't do this with motherboard software, and they want you to see the full effect. So that is a pretty cool feature. It's not synced with this motherboard. The motherboard and all the case fans are kind of doing their own thing here. But if you want a light show, you got it here. You see all the fans are doing their sequence of addressable RGB effects, and then the RAM itself has its addressable RGB effect, which is pretty cool. Unfortunately, I do have to have 2 software suites loaded to do that, and I would need a third. I can do the same thing with my EVGA card. I'm not going to download the EVGA software right now, but you can do that, and you'd have three RGB apps running in the background to control that. Now, I do have to flip over back to my screen because I do want to give you a word of warning about these software suites. They require a ton of processing power. This is something you probably have never seen anybody else mention. But, for instance, right now, just to get my RAM to do that, what they call the spiral rainbow, it's using 1.5% of my CPU's capacity. And I've got a 9900K in here. All right? So I'm just going to show you, when I shut off the lighting, I'm going to shut off the lighting. iCUE should drop. Let's see, there it goes. You saw it here first, guys. I dropped 1% of my CPU load just by turning off the lighting on my RAM. So that is a little bit of a disadvantage. Okay, if you're going for all-out benchmarks, or you want to tweak your game so you have maximum quality, well, your RAM lighting is sucking up 1% of your system's power. I'm going to turn it back on just to show you that was no fluke. Okay. Turning it back on, and it jumped back up to 1.7%. So that's a shame. From my point of view, that is a shame, particularly now that Corsair is requiring you to use iCUE for its RAM lighting. All right, so just lighting up that RAM takes 1% of my 9900K's processing power, which is pretty significant considering how powerful that CPU is. Now, I'm just going to leave you with one last thing. This is called Asus Comet. There's like a comet flying through my PC. Let's see how it works. It's a little bit distracting to see the RAM, but there you go. So every 10 seconds or so, I get a flash of light through my system. My 6 Thermaltake ARGB fans light up in sequence. That is pretty cool. You can see there that I'd actually have to reorder them. It looks like it's going from front to rear to top. If I wanted to be really organized about the lighting on this system, I'd have to light them in series so that I have the fans, it starts from the front and then to the cooler and then to the rear. Anyway, these are challenges you can take on for yourself if you want the ultimate RGB setup, but I'm just showing you kind of what's possible and what's out there today in 2019. Pretty cool stuff. Thank you again to Thermaltake for providing the A500 case, the Water 3.0 360 ARGB sync cooler, as well as its ARGB fans. Thank you to Corsair for providing its Dominator Platinum RGB RAM. And thank you, of course, to Samsung for its 970 Pro 1TB PCIe solid-state drive, which this whole system is running on. Again, I'm Ari from the Tech Buyers Guru. That concludes this series of build videos for 2019. I hope that you've learned something new from watching this video or any of the other videos in the series. If you have questions or comments, please post them below. And of course, like and subscribe to show me that this is content that you appreciate and you'd like to see more of it. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you next time.